Inspiring Journeys, the Inside Story. Hi, my name is Lisa Ritchie. I'm the Executive VP of the Chinese Chamber of Commerce of Arizona. I'm also the VP of AACAA Arizona. On behalf of these two organizations, along with AZ Chinese News, we're conducting a series of interviews to share with you the inside stories of the successful and influential people. Our first interviewee is Professor Douglas Guthrie at the Thunderbird School of Global Management. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you so much for spending time with me today to share your experience with us. Your experience and insights are incredibly valuable to us. I know, in addition to teaching, my understanding is that you are also the director of the China initiatives at the school. Can you talk a little bit about your role in this position?
Sure. Thank you for coming and thank you for interviewing me. It's a great honor to be here to talk to you all. Thunderbird School of Global Management is just a wonderful place to be thinking about doing business and doing management in the global economy today. And so we specialize on things like international trade and global mindset and international business. And so we teach in those areas, but we also like to, as a school, continue to have ways in which we're engaging the outside community. Okay, so I've spent my entire career being a China scholar and thinking and writing about China, teaching about China. I even spent some time away in the corporate sector in China. And so my goal and my occupation in that job as Executive Director of China Initiatives is to help the school think broadly about how to engage different organizations around the world. For example, the Chinese Chamber of Commerce in Arizona. We also have a relationship with Global Ties Arizona and the Phoenix Council on Foreign Relations. And so my job is to really help us think about how those relate to China. And so anything that has to do with China, I get involved in that and sort of help the dean and the leadership team think about it. In addition to doing things here in Phoenix, we also have programs in China. So for example, we have an online Masters of Leadership and Management that we send around the world and we teach all over the world. We have a very specific one in Mandarin. So both teach in the program but help us think through how to market it. And one of the things that we do there is we engage with places in China. For example, Tempe has a sister city relationship with Zhenjiang. Phoenix has a sister city relationship with Chengdu. And so I get involved with the conversations that go on that help us think through about Thunderbird's teaching role with respect to China, but also our global role with respect to building relationships with Chinese organizations.
Wow, the initiatives sound so important in today's environment. That's great. You have AB in East Asian languages, concentration in Chinese literature from the University of Chicago, and MA and PhD in organization sociology from the University of California, Berkeley. I heard you're fluent in Mandarin Chinese, right?
I am.
Yeah. So how did you decide to study the Chinese language and culture?
Well, thank you for that question. I mean, it's really been a journey, and it's a journey that I've very, very close to my heart. So what began as an undergraduate degree at the University of Chicago, I first thought I would just go to Chicago and study economics. Chicago's famous for neoclassical economic theory, and of course you go study economics. But they also have language requirements. And at the time, I had a Taiwanese roommate. He dared me to take Chinese. At the time, I thought I would just study German. That's what I studied in high school, no problem. But he said, Doug, China's the future. And this was about 1988. And so, China's opening had just happened about 8 years earlier. And so I didn't know, but he said what you can always push a 19-year-old to do by saying, I dare you, you're afraid. And I said, I'll show you, I'll study Chinese, it'll be fine. And so I went. I can tell you, Lisa, I just fell in love with the language. I fell in love with the language, the culture, the history. I just felt like this whole world was opening up to me. And I loved staying in the language labs and listening to the tapes and memorizing which tones were which and speaking with my roommate. And it just changed me. I just didn't realize that was going to happen. At the same time, I was taking an ancient Chinese history course with Professor Edward Shaughnessy. And we were just learning so much about this deep history that I never knew of. I grew up in suburbs of Pittsburgh. I didn't know anything about this. And so it just changed me. And that year I felt China is my future and I have to go be in China. So I took a year off school and went to study language in Taiwan for a year. Came back and I decided, I'll minor in economics, but what I really want to do is be a Chinese language, literature, and history major. And so I changed my major and majored in Chinese language, literature, and history. And then when I graduated from college, I realized I was still so interested in the transformation China was undergoing. So I wanted to study economics still. Economics as a field is very focused on numbers and data, but I wanted to be focused on people. The time I had spent in Taiwan was transformative for me. It just made me, it moved my heart to be near Chinese people and Chinese culture and Chinese history. And so I went into the field of sociology, because sociology, if you think of economics as over here as very, very tied to numbers and data, and anthropology is over here very tied to people and ethnography. Sociology is a little bit in the middle. So sociology, we use methods from both sides, but it's important to be out in the field. And so I had an advisor there named Thomas Gold, who was just a famous China scholar, and he kind of taught me how to mix doing economic analysis with doing in-depth interviewing with people on the ground in China. And it just changed my life. After that, I was just off and running with a career. I became a young assistant professor at NYU and then became a business school professor in organizational learning. And it was just a transformative moment for me.
Wow, sounds like an amazing journey. You're so lucky to meet somebody who had a vision back in 1988.
His father is actually a fairly well-known China scholar. His name is Xu Zuoyun. And when he said this thing with such conviction to me, he said, "Doug, trust me. What's happening in China is very big. China is your future." And so to your point, I was so lucky to have him as a roommate because it changed my life.
That's great. So you were a senior director at Apple in Shanghai, China. What do you consider your greatest achievement at Apple in China?
So it's a great question. I had a career in academia before I went to Apple. So I first was a professor at New York University, and I was both in the sociology department but also in the Stern School of Business. And then I became a dean. I was the dean of the business school at George Washington University. And throughout that entire time, I was really trying to find ways to help educate students and educate executives on how to think about China's transformation. And then when I left the deanship at George Washington, I really felt like I needed to get back into the field. I needed to be back inside of China, going deep with a real deep understanding of what was happening. And it was a new era. And I got a call from Apple. And Apple asked me if I'd be willing to go to China for them and be the head of Apple University in China. And to me, it was just an amazing opportunity because I got to do the leadership development work that I love teaching about, but I also got to do the on-the-ground teaching about navigating China. So you asked the question, what was my biggest accomplishment there? Right. And I would have to say that I think the biggest accomplishment was helping Tim Cook and the leadership team understand how China was changing. From 2001 to 2013, China entered the WTO in 2001.
Yes.
And it was a much more open marketplace. There was no longer allowed to have a quid pro quo for market access, and that happens to be the year that Apple entered China.
Right.
And so Apple's experience in China was from 2001 onward. And under President Xi, it was very clear that he wanted to get back to a kind of partnership with foreign companies, 合作伙伴. And so at that time, I needed to watch what was going on with China, but also needed to convince the Apple leadership team that it was very important not just to be in China because there was an amazing manufacturing supply chain there,
right,
but to actually show up as partners, 合作伙伴.
Oh, yes.
And so teaching that inside of Apple, I think, was my greatest accomplishment, and I'm very proud of the work we did together.
That's wonderful. How long did you work for Apple?
I was there for 5 years, so I was there from 2014 to 2019. Oh. My wife and kids were experiencing China and there with me, but it felt like it was time. They were following me around the world a lot, and it felt like it was time to allow them to get back home, and so we came back in 2019.
Yeah, I heard you were saying Chinese 合作伙伴. Can you say something else to the audience in Chinese?
是，我心里想就是中国人。我最喜欢说的一个中国句子是成功只有一条路，那就是什么？那就是全力以赴。
非常好，非常棒 excellent. Did you pick up some Shanghainese as well?
A little bit. 我心里想就是中国人，但是我心里真的是一个上海人，因为我第一次住在上海是94年的时候，所以是很久以前，所以我学了一点的上海话，但是我阿拉上海人，但是我的上海话不来塞。
Oh, okay. Do you like, in Shanghai they have this soup dumplings. Did you try that?
Yeah, of course. All of Chinese food is wonderful for me, although when people ask me my favorite Chinese food, I always have to laugh because when I think about it, I think about my morning rituals. And of course, when I think of my favorite Chinese food, I say 烧饼油条饼的豆浆. But everybody says, that doesn't sound good when I describe what it is. But I'm like, but it's just
Fried dough and soy milk. My favorite.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. When you were there, did they give you a Chinese name?
中国的名字是顾道阁，顾是顾客的顾，道是道理的道，人格是人格的格。But they didn't give it to me. My Chinese teacher when I was 我是在芝加哥大学，他是帮我起的那个名字。
Oh, very interesting, meaningful name.
Yeah.
Yes, excellent. Professor, you've been studying China for many years. How would you describe the current relationship between the U.S. and China?
Well, that's a great question, and it's a really important question because here we are, the two largest economies in the world and the world's two largest trading partners, and it is essential that we are partners in the closest sense of the word, right? I mean, since Deng Xiaoping went to visit Jimmy Carter in 1979, and Jingji Kaifang opened the doors to China, and we saw this relationship grow, and it grew over the course of the 1980s. Then we have the deeper engagement policy with President Clinton, and continuing throughout the 1990s.
Yes.
And then China's entry into the World Trade Organization. So it's been crucial to kind of bring China along in its economic development and economic growth, and for the U.S. to be a very close, deep partner. Now, in the 1990s, pre-WTO entry, that partnership was in some ways defined by the ways in which interactions happened, right? So if you wanted to be a foreign company operating in China, you had to have a 合作项目, right? You had to have a 合作企业, right? So joint venture, technology transfer, all of the things that were helping China develop.
Right.
Then when China entered the WTO, it became illegal by WTO standards to have a quid pro quo for market access. And so companies like Apple entered China, and they just sort of benefited from the beautiful manufacturing supply chain. And then President Xi came into power, and again, there was a lot more of a focus on we have to get back to 合作伙伴. We have to get back to the ways in which we can develop together. And since that time, things have become much more tense, right? And of course, so important that we continue to develop very, very close engagement relationships in which the two largest economies in the world and the two largest trading partners are partners in continuing to develop economically. And so I don't think we have any other choice. We have to do that. It's essential. And so my goal as a China scholar and as somebody who teaches students but also advises executives is to help us continue to think how to be partners and how to grow together. And so, the 2023 I think was a very big, important year because we saw China come out as a very powerful player on the global stage. We saw Secretaries Blinken, Yellen, Raimondo all visit China. We saw China brokering the peace deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And so it's really clear. And then we saw President Xi fly to San Francisco and visit President Biden. So my hope is that we are going to continue to develop this path of us being close partners and close trading partners, but also close global geopolitical partners. It's essential. It's really important. And so that's really my passion.
Yes, that's correct. I totally agree with you. I think the two countries should be partners instead of enemies, right?
Of course.
But there's still a lot of challenges. What do you think are the challenges facing the two countries?
Well, I mean, the challenges, on good days, I think these challenges are just natural between the two largest economies in the world that are very competitive with each other, right? I mean, China's economy continues to grow at about 5.3, 5.4% over the last year. And with the pace that it's keeping in the U.S. at its growth rates, China is probably going to be the largest economy in the world in about 7 or 8 years. And I believe that's going to happen because China's economic fundamentals are very, very strong. I did a lot of work for Apple, as we discussed, and I spent a lot of time with Chinese suppliers and analyzing China's manufacturing supply chain. China is not a powerful economy just because of a deep, cheap labor pool. It's a powerful economy because for the last 40 years, it has built the most sophisticated manufacturing supply chain in the world. Companies like Apple and Tesla and Walmart, they can't go anywhere else. Yes, people talk about Foxconn building a final assembly plant in Chennai, so therefore Apple could make phones in India. No. China is Apple's partner because of the complexity of the manufacturing supply chain. Apple doesn't work with one company in China, Foxconn. It works with about 1,600 companies in China in the supply chain. And so it just gives you a sense of just how complex this relationship is and how important it is. But to your question, our two countries are very ambitious and they're a little competitive. And so we start to think, well, okay, you know, President Trump is going to unleash $300 billion in tariffs to kind of push back and push development other places. President Biden, $18 billion recently in tariffs on products related to electric vehicles. But I think we have to, again, continue to push our countries to be collaborative entities and be collaborative partners in geopolitical development. And I think that'll happen. I just think that there's a lot of competition between us right now, and so you have competitive players on both sides wanting to win.
Yes, I hope the two countries will continue to be on the right path. Thank you. As we all know, Phoenix is booming, especially with the semiconductor industry. TMC is expanding here. I remember you mentioned that China is also very important to Phoenix. If I remember correctly, you mentioned Phoenix is the ground of the U.S.-China relationship. Can you please elaborate on that?
It's a wonderful question, and I really do believe this. I believe that Phoenix is ground zero for U.S.-China relations as we go forward into the next decade, and here's why. Phoenix is the fastest growing economy in America. It's the 5th largest economy in America now, and it's a place where we're thinking deeply about hardware as well as software, right? So Silicon Valley has its spot, and services and high-end services have their spot in New York and other places. But right now, Phoenix's growth, particularly because TSMC has come here and Intel is here, and we're building fab sites here that are thinking deeply about the incredibly important aspects of the hardware that's behind all that we're doing in the developing economy. And so it's so crucial that, again, that U.S.-China relations continue to develop in a partnership framework. And we have such a high-energy business community here and so much going on in terms of the development of manufacturing supply chains here that it only makes sense that the U.S. and China, and in particular Phoenix and China, will continue to work together to build this relationship. So I'm very, very bullish on things like sister cities like Phoenix and Chengdu, Tempe and Zhenjiang. These are places that can really continue to collaborate to grow the relationship from a business perspective, but also from a partnership perspective.
That's wonderful. We're very excited about this potential opportunity.
Yes.
I know you're partnering with the Chinese Chamber of Commerce to do a series of seminars on doing business in China, especially in today's China. So what motivates you to do that?
Well, it's a wonderful question. It's really important to me to really think deeply about not just teaching students who are in our Masters of Global Management program, but also to talk to executives and people in the community about the importance of U.S.-China relations and the importance of 合作伙伴, of partnership. And so it's been a really interesting time to get to know people in the community. And I met President John Lee, the president of the Chamber of Commerce, at one of the events that we were doing here. And we started talking about how we had common ideas and common viewpoints about how important it is to educate the community about the importance of U.S.-China relations and about how different China is today compared to what it was like to do business there 20 years ago. And so as we continued to talk about it, we cooked up an idea that we could have a partnership and we could think about using the Thunderbird School of Global Management as a launch plan in partnership with the Chinese Chamber of Commerce Arizona to really educate people in the community about what this is about. the final thing I'll say is I have been so excited about what it's like to do this work in Phoenix. When I used to come here as a child, because my grandfather was a faculty member at Arizona State, that was in the 1970s, and Phoenix was a much different place. Today, Phoenix is the fastest growing economy in America. It's the 5th largest economy. There's a lot of excitement here. And so thinking about what U.S.-China relations mean for Phoenix specifically, I just think is a remarkable opportunity, and so I'm so excited about it.
Yeah, that's great. When is the first seminar?
So the first seminar is on June 26th from 3:45 to 5:45 p.m. at the Thunderbird School of Global Management here at 401 North 1st Street. We're going to do a little bit of teaching, but we're also here to really create a dialogue and a conversation amongst students, executives, community members about what U.S.-China relations are about today and what it means to think about doing business in China today.
That's great. It's actually in this classroom, right?
Yes, yeah, it's in this classroom, so we're sitting exactly where the people that attend this event will be, and we're so excited to have people here, so welcome. Please come.
Thank you. Great. You have lived at different places. Where were you the happiest?
Is 1994 in Shanghai. I just felt like I was living this dream. So here I was, again, I was a student at the University of Chicago thinking I would be an economics major, then fell in love with Chinese language, literature, and history, but was still interested in economics. The next thing I know, I'm at the University of California, Berkeley, studying economic sociology, and I have a grant to go off and live in Shanghai and study the Chinese economy from the ground. I mean, it was just a dream for me. And so that has to be the time that I was happiest in my life.
That's wonderful. Glad to hear. Which historical figure do you most identify with?
Ooh, that's a tough question because I don't want to sound self-aggrandizing and say that I identify with somebody big or important, but you did ask about a historical figure. And so I'm going to just say that because I have a piece of China in me, but I also grew up with music, and so my father played music for us when we were growing up, and I play music for my kids when I'm trying to connect with them. And so the one figure that seems to balance at least the music piece and the building bridges piece is John Denver. So John Denver, people may not know this, but when Deng Xiaoping went to visit Jimmy Carter in 1979, they went to the Kennedy Center to see a bunch of performances, and one of the performances there was John Denver. And it's the reason when I would take my kids out on the street and play music, everybody in China knows "Take Me Home, Country Roads," and so I sort of identify with John Denver.
Wow, "Country Road, Take Me Home." That's one of my favorite songs. When I travel long distance in the car, I love to listen to that song.
It's so fun. I always tell executives that are going to do business in China that if you're taken out for karaoke, you have to know "Take Me Home, Country Roads" because it's going to come up.
Yes, very popular. Who are your heroes in real life?
Another tough question. Well, there are lots of people that I admire and lots of people who are my heroes. But for my very specific area of work, I think my two heroes that I think about and talk about a lot. When Deng Xiaoping was 15 years old, he was in Chongqing, and he had just finished school, and he wanted to go on a study abroad program to France. And his father didn't want him to go, and his father said, "Why do you want to go to France?" And he said, "I want to go gain all the knowledge I can and learn from the West so I can come back and save China." Now, that might sound like propaganda, and it might sound like just what his teachers had said, but you fast forward, this was 1919, you fast forward 60 years, Deng Xiaoping made it through the warlord period and the revolution and the famines of the 1950s, late 1950s, and the chaos and turmoil at that time. And he did come to power in 1979, and he got on a plane and went to visit Jimmy Carter, my other hero. Jimmy Carter was a very unassuming president. Nobody thought that a peanut farmer would become a president. And the next thing you know, in January of 1979, these two men are sitting in a room, and Deng Xiaoping is saying, "Jingji Kaifang." And he did save China. He opened China up to the world. And so I love that story, and I think whenever I teach leadership, I always tell that story, that a 15-year-old kid had a dream, and he lived out that dream 60 years later.
Yes. I think that meeting between him and Jimmy Carter changed the history of China.
Changed the history of China, but also changed the history of the world. I mean,
Correct.
It is such an important moment in global history. I don't think people realize it. Often the students that I teach to, they don't realize just how important that moment was for both leaders.
I agree.
I think of living people, I have a tremendous amount of respect for the people that guided me in my China journey. So when I think about people like my professors like Gregory Lee or Edward Shaughnessy, these aren't names that are famous names in the global geopolitical system, but they are the China scholars that had such passion for what they were doing. And they were people that just taught me how to be, how to be a great China scholar. In addition, Thomas Gold, who was somebody who was my advisor at the University of California, Berkeley, and I just learned how to do deep on-the-ground research. In addition, I would say Andy Walder, who's one of the great China scholars of his generation, and my other advisor, Neil Flickstein, who was just an amazing mind in thinking about economic sociology. And so those are the kinds of people that I admire.
I'm going to ask you the other way. Which person do you despise?
Despise. Ooh. So I don't like when people don't listen to others when they're having an intense dialogue or debate. I don't like when people are judgmental about other cultures and not willing to learn about different cultures and different histories. And so rather than say people that I despise, I'll just say what I don't like when people are not open to learning and engagement. And so when I see that kind of behavior, it turns me off a little bit.
Okay. What's your greatest fear in life?
I feel very lucky and blessed in the world because I've been given a lot. I've been given the ability to work very hard. I was given the ability to study hard and learn. I've been given the ability to be around wonderful children and a wonderful family. And so my greatest fear is not delivering on those benefits. So, given all that I've been given on the academic side of life, I would be very sad and disappointed in myself if I didn't continue to help the world understand China better. And given my 3 beautiful children, I would be very sad if I didn't make the most of my attempts to be a great dad and be very present for them. And so those are the things that I think about when I think about what I fear.
That's great. You've been very successful academically and in business. Do you have any regrets?
There was a time when I was so obsessed with my work on China, and I was so obsessed with writing the next big book and so obsessed with doing the great work for Apple. And I wasn't as present of a dad as I wish I would have been. Like, I was very hardworking, and I would even use the term workaholic, just crazy all the time, obsessed. And I regret not being as present as I could have or should have been during that time. Thankfully, I came to the realization of that being the truth at an early enough point. My children, I think, were young enough that I still had time to be a good dad and to fix that. And so if I have any regrets, it's just that sometimes I had become very obsessed with my work and I wasn't present for the people in relationships I was with.
When you have passion for something, I can understand. You want to devote all your time to that subject.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Do you have a motto you want to share with people?
Well, I told you one model, which is 成功只有一条路，那就是全力以赴. So
Right.
that's one model, but I'll give you a different model just because I already gave you that one. So in addition to teaching about economic development in China, I also teach leadership. And I don't like the idea that leadership, people think leadership is about the position that you're in. And so if I'm a high-level position, I'm a leader. So I always like to say to my students, leadership is not about the position you're in. It's about how well you do in making the lives of the people around you better. That's leadership. And so that's my motto.
That's great. If you could change one thing in the world, what would that be?
Ooh, these are big questions. So I want us to live in a world in which we all listen to each other and we're all passionate about hearing and engaging and learning from each other. And whether that's just people across the room or people in different circumstances than you, we're all so open to and passionate about learning from each other, learning from different histories, cultures, and experiences.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor, for taking your time out from your busy schedule to talk to us today. Really appreciate it. We wish you great success in the future.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to talk to you.
Once again, on behalf of the Chinese Chamber of Arizona, AACAA Arizona, AZ Chinese News, we really appreciate your time and sharing your experience with us today. Looks like it's so important for China and the U.S. to create a win-win situation in the long run.
So important, and I want to
Thank you so much.
thank you. And don't forget to come to the Thunderbird School of Global Management, June 26th, 3 to 7 p.m., 401 North 1st Street in downtown Phoenix.
We look forward to seeing you next time.